Perspectives in Psychology, Unit 9. Introduction. What's included in this presentation? A description of two different psychological perspectives, an evaluation of the key assumptions of the identified psychological perspectives, an evaluation of the work of key theorists relating to each of the identified psychological perspectives, an analysis of the similarities and differences between two perspectives in psychology, and an evaluation of the application of two perspectives to contemporary issues in psychology. Descriptions of two psychological perspectives. Within psychology, there are different psychological perspectives that help and guide psychologists to understand and treat people in their care. Each perspective has different theories as to why an individual behaves in a certain way. The main psychological perspectives are behaviorism, cognitive psychology, psychoanalysis or psychodynamic psychology, biological psychology, and social psychology. To delve deeper into what some of these perspectives entail, we will now look at behaviorism and cognitive psychology more closely. Behaviorism emerged in 1898 in early stages of developmental psychology, Greenwood 2020. The perspective assumes that an individual's behaviour is a result of direct or indirect learning. There are two main types of behaviourism. The first is radical behaviourism, where all learning is the result of response mechanisms. The next is social learning, where an individual's behaviour is the result of observing and copying role models. Behaviourism rejects the idea of free will, believing that the environment determines all behaviour. McLeod 2023. Behaviourism includes the practice of positive reinforcement, for example, in rewarding a person for good behaviour and positive actions. Behaviourists also believe that all behaviour is learnt, so can therefore be unlearnt. Unlike other perspectives, behaviourists believe that humans are born as a blank slate, meaning that each person is the result from what they learn in their environment. Now on to the perspectives of cognitive psychology. Cognitive means mental processes. As Kaneda Jordan 2024 explains, the cognitive perspective in psychology focuses on how the interactions of thinking, emotion, creativity, and problem-solving abilities affect how and why you think the way you do. A cognitive psychologist's approach differs from a behaviourist's in the sense that they believe unobservable processes such as problem-solving and decision-making play a role in people's behaviour. This is rejected by behaviourists. Cognitive psychology became more prominent after the 1950s. Cherry, 2024. Behaviourism was a perspective long before cognitive psychology was discovered. The key assumptions of both psychological perspectives. With each of the psychological perspectives discussed, there are assumptions which they are based on. The assumptions of the behavioural approach in psychology were summarised by John B. Watson, 1913. They were as follows. Behavioural psychology examines behaviours that can be observed and measured. Our behaviours are primarily acquired through interactions with the environment, the nurture approach. Since animals and humans demonstrate comparable learning patterns, findings from animal experiments can be extended to humans. And the behavioural approach conducts experiments that are mostly lab-controlled in line with its objective and scientific approach to psychology. Then there is the cognitive perspective. The main assumptions for this approach are internal mental processes can be studied, the mind works in a similar way to a computer, individuals function as information processors involving input, storage, and the retrieval of data. Internal mental processes cause behaviour. As with all psychological perspectives, there are both strengths and limitations. This is partly why there are different perspectives, as none of them are perfect from a scientific point of view. We will now see what the strengths and limitations are for behaviourism and cognitive psychology. Behaviourism, the strengths. It has scientific credibility as experiments are carried out. This gives little room for arguments because of the evidence. Crucial discoveries were made in psychology because of research involving animals, including rats, dogs, and monkeys. The two central concepts in behavioural psychology are useful in the treatment of phobias. And now for the limitations. Behaviourism eliminates biological factors as explanations for behaviour, meaning low levels of serotonin, which can cause depression, is something that's dismissed. Decision-making, memory, and problem-solving isn't considered when assessing human behaviour, something that other psychologists may disagree with. Now looking at the strengths and weaknesses of cognitive psychology. Strengths include scientific tests like MRI scans are used to produce reliable and replicable outcomes. By studying cognitive processes, we can gain insight into psychological conditions like depression. Cognitive behavioural therapy can be effectively applied to treat conditions like depression. And now for the limitations. Genetic causes of mental disorders like schizophrenia and bipolar are overlooked. Validity of lab experiments is reduced as participants undergo complicated tests in an artificial and unfamiliar environment. An evaluation of the work of key theorists relating to each of the psychological perspectives. With each psychological perspective, there is either an individual or group of individuals who contributed their knowledge and expertise to validate the theory that they created. They will have all put forward arguments as to why they believe their theory is correct and would often try to disprove the work of others. Behaviorism has three key theorists: Ivan Pavlov, John B. Watson, and B.F. Skinner. Here is some more information about them. It was in Russia in the late 19th century that a scientist named Ivan Pavlov accidentally discovered classical conditioning. He knew that his dogs salivated at the sight of food being presented to them. Pavlov designed a scientific experiment where he paired a neutral stimulus, which was the sound of a bell, with the presentation of food, classed as the unconditional stimulus. He discovered that by ringing the bell whilst presenting the food, the dogs soon associated the sound of the bell with their food being presented. Pavlov went on to discover that he had the ability to make the dogs salivate on demand without any food present and by just ringing the bell. This meant that the bell became the new stimulus. This was then known as classical conditioning. In the 20th century, John B. Watson, an American psychologist, was intrigued by the findings of Pavlov. He believed that psychology was a science, using observable measurements and basing theories off of facts. Watson believed that human development could only be based on what could be seen. He was famous for saying how he would be capable of raising infants in his own specified world and would be able to turn them into whatever specialist he wanted, whether that be a doctor, lawyer, artist, or even a beggar. This was regardless of the individual's abilities, talents, or the race of their ancestors. He undertook more experiments relating to classical conditioning, gaining more insight into this field of behaviorism, although today his practices would be viewed as unethical. Watson experimented on an 11-month-old child named Albert. He conditioned Albert to become afraid of rats by making loud noises, the unconditioned stimulus, at the same time as presenting him with a white rat. The noise naturally startled Albert and it made him cry. This was the unconditioned response. Once Albert began to associate the neutral rat with the loud noises, the rat became the conditioned stimulus, meaning Albert also gave the same reaction to the rat, even on its own, without the loud noises needing to be present. Therefore, Watson had successfully conditioned Albert to be afraid of rats. The last theorist in regard to behaviorism is B.F. Skinner, who was an influential American psychologist. He developed the concepts of operant conditioning. He also believed that psychology needed to be experimented on, with observations and results studied. Skinner would use a clear box with the test subject inside and could therefore witness the animal interacting with the tests and its environment. The box became known as the Skinner box. Skinner's work on operant conditioning included a learning process in which the likelihood of a specific behaviour was based on positive or negative reinforcement. The test subject, oftentimes a rat, would associate pleasure or displeasure of the reinforcement behaviour. Operant conditioning is still common practice today, where good behaviour is rewarded and bad behaviour is punished. Animal trainers rely heavily on Skinner's technique to train dogs and other animals. Cherry, 2024. Cognitive psychology has two key theorists, Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky. Now to explore some of the key works of these theorists in more detail. Jean Piaget was a Swiss psychologist in the 20th century. He created highly influential theories on the stages of mental development amongst children, becoming a leading figure in the fields of cognitive theory and developmental psychology. Jean Piaget, 2021. In 1936, Piaget published one of his key works on the subject of cognitive development. The theory suggests that children move through 4 key stages of development. These include the sensory motor stage at ages 0 to 2, where babies explore and learn all about the world through their senses and movements, like touch, smell, listening, and listening to their surroundings. Next is the pre-operational stage from ages 2 to 7. This is when children start to use language and engage in pretend play. They are unable to yet understand the perspectives of others. After is the concrete operational stage from ages 7 to 11. Children begin to think more logically about concrete events. They can perform simple mental operations and understand conversations. The final stage of Piaget's theory is formal operational stage, which takes place from the age of 11 through to adulthood. It's within this stage that individuals learn to think more hypothetically. Although Piaget contributed a lot to the field of psychology, his study lacked diversity. This means that due to children in different cultures advancing at different rates, his study isn't fully accurate. It's now time to look at the psychologist Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky was a Soviet psychologist who created the theory known as the socio-cultural theory of cognitive development. This theory emphasizes the roles of social interaction and culture in shaping a child's cognitive abilities. Vygotsky identified 4 elementary mental functions that we're born with: attention, sensation, perception, and memory. It is with social interaction that these functions turn into higher mental functions. His theory suggests that children learn from the beliefs and attitudes of those around them. He proposed that a child's social interactions with more learned peers may support a child's potential development in mental functions. Maine, 2022. One of the limitations of Vygotsky's theory is that it's difficult to test scientifically, meaning that it's unknown how accurate the theory is. Similarities and differences between behaviorism and cognitive psychology. Each psychological perspective aims to explain and demonstrate an individual's behaviour and way of thinking. But as we've already seen with the evaluations and descriptions of 2 different perspectives, opinions on the topic can share both similarities and differences too. A few things to consider when comparing perspectives are research methods and whether free will is accepted as part of their theory. We will now take a closer look at what the similarities and differences are between behaviorism and cognitive psychology. The first similarity to look at is that both of these perspectives are still used today. Behaviorism is used in the training of a variety of different animals. Cognitive behavioural therapy is derived from cognitive psychology. It's currently helpful for people suffering from a variety of mental health conditions. Both perspectives agree that nurture plays a role in behaviour. This means that they acknowledge the influence our environment and social interactions have on our behaviour. Their research methods are largely the same too. They both conduct their research using scientific methods to collect data and conduct laboratory experiments. The final similarity to observe is the fact that both perspectives have come under scrutiny from fellow psychologists who may disagree with their theory. Arguments are often made to try and disprove the work of others and to persuade them to have a different way of thinking. The first thing to note when looking at the differences between both perspectives is that they were introduced at different times. Behaviourism was first in the 19th century, followed by cognitive psychology in the 20th century. Additionally, classical conditioning, an aspect which is part of behaviourism, was discovered by Pavlov accidentally. This cannot be said for any other aspects like cognitive therapy, where developments were made gradually and purposely. A behaviourist does not believe in free will, meaning they believe an individual is enabled to make choices independent of external influences. This is known as hard determinism. On the contrary, a cognitive is more likely to believe in soft determinism. This means they acknowledge that the behaviour is influenced by external and internal factors, and that an individual still has freedom and responsibility for their actions and behaviour. An evaluation of the application of two perspectives to contemporary issues in psychology. For the final part of this presentation, there's an evaluation of two different perspectives and how they can be applied to contemporary issues in psychology. For an explanation on what is meant by contemporary issues, it is said by Fiveable 2024, a contemporary issue refers to a current problem or debate that is happening in the present time. They can be influenced by social, economic, environmental, and ethical factors. They can be put into categories, social, economic, and environmental and ethical categories, and can be impacted by changes in the ecosystems, cultures, and lifestyle. Within the UK, mental health problems are an issue that many people experience. 1 in 4 adults and 1 in 10 children experience mental illness, and many more care for people who do, NHS 2024. Psychology is defined as science of the mind, as it researches stress, anxiety, depression, and resilience. This is why mental health and psychology are strongly linked. One way to provide a positive intervention in mental health issues is to apply the biological perspective. The biological factor contributes to mental health issues. For example, genetics and brain chemistry can be studied with a variety of different and treated with a variety of different medications, which are classed as biological interventions. Schizophrenia and bipolar are two examples where biological interventions would be necessary. You could use antipsychotic or mood stabilising medication to help control these. Medication to treat depression are known as antidepressants and come in different categories like SSRIs and SNRIs. Some of the medications used to treat anxiety could be medications such as benzodiazepines like Valium and Xanax, and also propranolol. The other perspective to discuss is psychodynamic psychology, which can be applied to mental health problems. It involves using a type of talking therapy called psychodynamic therapy. It involves talking to a healthcare professional about your current problems, and they help you to cope. It can also help people understand their own behaviour and could highlight childhood experiences that impact their behaviour and their actions today. The subtypes of cultural psychology and social psychology and also behaviourism are associated with the effects or an impact of diversity and inclusion. It is these two perspectives that can be applied when dealing with this topic. Psychology can give us a greater insight into a concept called implicit bias. This is where unconscious attitudes, prejudices and judgments towards a person or a group of people happen. These biases could relate to age, gender, appearance or sexuality. Although it's natural for everybody to have an unconscious bias which is based on our upbringing and own experiences, it's important for us to recognise and deal with it in a non-confrontational way. Regarding workplace and organisational issues, biological and cognitive psychology are two perspectives that can be applied to address these. Some of these issues may include employee productivity, lack of motivation and weak leadership. Cognitive psychology plays a role in learning and development and could combine workshops and training programs to boost staff performance and competence. In terms of biological psychology, practicing mindfulness is an effective way to combat stress and improve mental health. A recap on what has been discussed through this presentation. Detailed descriptions of different psychological perspectives, the history of these perspectives and how they came about, evaluations of the work of key theorists, comparisons of behaviourism and cognitive psychology, and evaluation of 2 different psychological perspectives in relation to contemporary issues in psychology. Here is a list of my references that help me with my work